another. He says, do you not know that so many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death, and just as Christ was, therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, death to the old, that just as Christ was raised from the glory of the dead by the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. United together in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Well, that ties into what we're going to look at next week as well. But the idea is you've gotten rid of the things that you were doing in order to do the things that you need to do. It's kind of like going on a diet. You know, the doctor says, here's your diet you're going to be on and everything. Well, you got to get rid of some of the things that may have been in your diet, and you take on some of the things that you're supposed to eat in your diet or whatever, you know, and whatever you're doing, because you cannot, as Jesus points out, you really can't serve two masters. While he's talking about God and money at that time, it is a good application even broader than that. So the admonition there is, you got to die to the old and live to the new. Ephesians 4. There's some real changes that need to take place in your life. Not reading all of those verses, but picking up in verse 20 and just reading through verse 24, it says, but you have not so learned Christ. He's talking about how their lives need to change. But you've not so learned Christ, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct, the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, that you may put on the new man which was created to God in true righteousness and holiness. See, here in the midst of this book, he's pointing out there is a dramatic change that needs to take place in your life. You're going to be a child of God. You're going to be a Christian. There is a change that takes place. For some who may have grown up within that concept of Christian living, it may not be as dramatic a change as it is for someone who's lived very foreign to God. But in either case, there is a change of loyalty and a change of leadership in your life. And that's what it gets down to, is listening and learning Christ and putting on Christ, putting off the old things, putting on the new things. That's just the way it works. You can't just integrate it into the old life. You must put on the new life. Jesus talked about that in some specific ways as well. Well, let's jump a little further down to Colossians, and then we'll get past these in just a moment. In Colossians, very similar, but again, picking up at verse 8, it says, but now you yourselves are to put off these things, and he lists some: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, and so forth. It said, since you put off the old deeds. There's some old things you need to put off, and you become renewed in your knowledge created in him. Then 2 Peter 3, beginning in verse 11 in this one. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, this is Peter talking about the ends of time. Since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for a new heavens and new earth in which righteousness dwells. But he says, what kind of people do we need to be as we point ourselves in this direction? And then one more. In that Romans 12, in the familiar passage, even Manny used this one last Sunday when he was speaking to us, when he talks about verse 2 in particular. But I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice. Sacrifice is a devotion, a sacrifice holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable or spiritual service. And then verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed or changed, metamorphosized is what it's saying, by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. In other words, so you can put into practice these things. Now, these are just snippets. I just threw these in because I wanted you to see some of the snippets and the reminders that our lives need change. They need a direction. They need a service. We cannot be what we once were. We've got to be what we have become or are becoming in him. Thoughts or questions at that point? Yes, sir.
They all seem to be directing at
Yes.
alive in Christ, speaking of your character and your conduct as a Christian.
Yes, sir, very much so. Yes, they are all directed at that ending of the old, the dying of the old, that separation, the beginning of the new. And character and conduct is throughout this. You're exactly right in that. And because how else do we recognize the change of a heart or a mind except in the conduct and the way it is conducted and by the manner we see it in that person's life? And I think you're right on target in these verses. And maybe that's why these are the ones that came to my mind so much in this week, because they had that relationship throughout. But really, that's infused in just about any place you want to look throughout the New Testament. And I know this is nothing new to you. You're saying, well, of course, we understand that. Die to the old, live to the new. That's exactly what it says. Okay. Well, when we talk about motivation for living the Christian life, what motivates us? Yes, we've got the scriptures and so forth, but what motivates us? So, what is it that gets us to want to live the different life? I put down a few. Maybe you've got some others. One is, I need to be a better man. Self-improvement. It's ingrained in the Christian life to be better. Better than you've been, better than you are. It is a part of our practice. We are to grow. What is it Paul said? I don't count myself to have apprehended. I'm not home yet. I'm not there yet. But I press on. He really pushes that point in that. That's one of the motivations, because I need to improve who I am. Another thing that people often lean upon is history or tradition. I think if we went around, we'd say, how did I get into this Christian life? Quite often it's because there had been somebody in the past or a part of it, family, parents, family members or something like that, have brought us into it. And we live a certain style of life. By that I mean certain restrictions and certain freedoms based upon, quite often, tradition or what we've already known. We live a certain way and we think, well, this is right and this is wrong because that's what I've already known or what I've understood prior to this. And so history and tradition. This is the way my father lived, so I live this way. This is the way my family lived for generations, so therefore I am. I had a really good friend many years ago. Well, that's been about 40 years ago. He was talking about his grandfather had left him some money, but it required him to never change his political party. He said he could not change his political party or he would not continue to receive from this estate. I thought that was kind of interesting, I thought, wow, boy, that's thinking. I think I'll do that. I don't want to be a political party. What could it be? I'm going to have to think on that a little bit. Anyway, but no, in all seriousness, that really was true and everything. It was stated in this, and he could not receive any more inheritance if he changed his political party. But history and tradition, family history, is a very strong and a powerful motivation in our lives. I think we have to admit that as well. And then there's pressure. Where do we get pressure to live the Christian life? Probably two sources. One is ourselves, and we've already kind of touched on that with self-improvement, but there's also this sense of guilt. I need to do this and so forth. But then there's the pressure of others, peer pressure, people around us, people that we know. And it's not, the pressure is, of course, not always towards the Christian life. It can be towards any life. Peer pressure is one of the most potent forces we deal with in our lives. And if you question that, go ask any politician who's tried to get elected to office. The pressure of groups and people around and the social structure that we live in puts a pressure on us to live and think and generally act in a certain way. And that affects us. let me give you a couple more, and then if you've got somebody, some you might think of, fear is one as well. Perhaps less today, I think, than maybe in the past, but I think quite often people would turn to God out of fear. They're afraid of hell. I don't want to go to hell. I live a certain way so I don't go to hell, and so forth. I've had people actually sit down and talk to me and said, have I done enough of the right things that I'm going to be all right and everything. And that's a difficult discussion to have with somebody. Now I say, no, you haven't done enough for me. That's not what I'd say. Just seeing if you were still awake on that. Yes, sir.
Back in the day, they would preach about hell and brimstone.
Oh, yeah. Yes, much more than we do today. It was, I think, a more effective tool. Tent meetings, a generation or two ago, it seemed to strike the psyche of our society much more than it does today. Today, people are much more like, well, I'm just not going to listen to that. Much more so. Maybe there's still some effect. Fear is not a bad tool. It is not a bad tool. It can be a bad tool, but it's not necessarily a bad tool. Fear, when it is drawn out of proper respect. Let's say somebody says, I'm afraid of rattlesnakes, or I have a fear of rattlesnakes. Well, there's good reason to fear a rattlesnake, because its bite and its poison can be a real problem to you, and some others like that. But am I afraid of snakes? Not necessarily. Am I afraid of rattlesnakes? No, there's none around here and everything. But that fear, proper respect of them in the place where they are. Some of you golfers, you ever go play golf at places like up at what Roman knows at Watonga? I've had some guys talk about it certain times of the year when they're out there. Said you got to be careful where you step when you're headed towards part of the course or something, because it's a pretty good haven for rattlesnakes in around there. And they used to have the rattlesnake roundups out there as well and all. But I'll let somebody else do that. That's not. But fear is a motivator sometimes to do the right thing. Yeah. Yes, Joel?
In Proverbs, I don't know how many times, but in Proverbs it says over and over that the fear of the Lord is the first step towards wisdom.
Yes, the fear of the Lord is a step towards wisdom. And really, and that is probably put in the right category, because it's understanding who God is, the power that he has. It's not that like, oh, I'm afraid of God, I got to do this because I'm afraid of God. It's more like, I know who you are, I know the power that you have, and I will respond appropriately to you because you are who you are. That's very good, very good. Thoughts at that at this point? Well, I've got one more on here. One is security. The last one I've got is security. Why do people do that? I want to be secure. Same reason you lock your door at night. I want to be secure. Did you ever get up in the morning and your door wasn't locked? That happens at our house every now and then. Somebody, the person who was supposed to lock the door didn't lock the door. But nobody came in. Nobody came and checked it to see if it was unlocked or anything like that. And all. But normally the door is locked. If you come to my house when the lights are out, or we just generally when we're inside, the front door is going to be locked. So, you're going to have to knock on the door, ring the doorbell or something. And still then, if I'm not there, Paula's probably not going to open it up without me there, because security, that's just the way it works. We understand. I want to be where I know I'm in as safe a place as I can be. And it's that way with God as well. Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing that you just said, how you want to know you're right with God, right with the Lord.
Yes.
And then it kind of might take the pressure off a little bit, but you just know that you're doing all you can to please the Lord
Yes. Yeah.
in everyday life.
Yeah.
Any too many worries.
Right. Well, we can get to a point where we start saying, well, how much is this? How much do I need to do? It's kind of like the police officer that came to my dad's house one time after he'd been broken into, and the police officer said, well, you can add double deadbolt locks. You can put bars on your windows and blah, blah, blah. And he said, and that'll turn away most. But he said, then there's the guy, if he really wants in, he'll just back a truck up to your door, knock it in, and come in and take what he wants, and he'll be gone before the police ever arrive. He'll be in and out that fast. There is no absolute security. We can still, in that, but we're dependent in God. We're dependent on his grace in Christ Jesus for that. But it is still up to our faith in him and our trust in him. Very good. Very good. I'm getting kind of far afield. Any other thoughts about that? And our motivations for living this. Motivation is important. Yeah, Bill?
What about a category for somebody who's done the research?
Okay.
Went out to search out the truth, did the research and said, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Okay. Yeah, just really based in knowledge. Yes. I've just come to this, maybe there is an indication of a need to search, or just maybe that's part of it. Said, wait a minute, I found this. I've often talked about Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur. He basically began his pursuit to prove that Jesus wasn't the Christ, and ended up believing that he was. Did the research and came to that.
What was the subtitle? Chronicle of Christ?
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. I think you're right. Yeah. Brian, you had something, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, I was going to say, someone in the same category for pressure, tradition, but others.
Others, yeah.
Examples,
Good examples. Yeah, oh, yeah.
ran the race
Yeah.
a lot longer than we have.
Yeah, when you see that good example, yeah. And somebody that's going down there, say, I'd like to be like him, I want to be like Brian. I want to be somebody like that, yeah. Oh, man. Do what?
Bill said Jaworski. I said, okay.
He wants to be like, that's wishful thinking on his part. Oh, in all seriousness. Blue, you had something.
What was a word or a promise from somebody you can count on, someone who's trustworthy,
Oh, okay.
that motivates you? The greatest one we have is from Christ, of course.
Okay.
Someone you can trust and you know that they're true to their word if they tell you this is going to happen.
Okay. That confidence in someone you can trust that brings you to make that kind of investment and so forth in that, and we know we can count on Christ in that regard. Very good. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Motivations for doing it. I think we could probably broaden our list. Did I miss anybody? I mean, if you got something, feel free. Okay. There are motivations why we want to pursue a certain kind of life. In particular, we're talking about living the Christian life. Peter talks about it here. Let's look at what he has to say in this. If we look at the passage at hand and look at this, notice the things that he says in this regard. Picking up verse 13, gird up the loins of your mind. In other words, be thinking. Don't just put yourself on idle. This is not something you just go in and you put yourself on idle. You don't have to think a thing along the way. This is not like a conversation with your wife or something like that. I didn't mean that. This is to be, you're to be thinking and considering in that regard. So gird up, that's what he's saying. Get together the loins of your mind and all. And that's a reference. That's like tightening up your belt. In those days, it was you're tying on your clothes and getting them ready to go. There's interesting deal when you remember when Elijah had prayed for the rain. He said the rain's coming, and he told Ahab he better get gone because the rain's coming. Well, it says he girded himself up. That means you tie up your clothing, get it tight enough so that you can go on the pursuit that you need to go on. So that's where he is in this regard. And so be thinking, get your mind in, we'd say get your mind in gear might be a way to do it. Do what? Clarity. Have that concise, that visualization, have it right, have the clarity of mind in that regard. And then he says, we depend on or we hope in that grace. We hope in that grace. Again, you rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you. Recognize that it's a gift. It's something that is given to you. Peter says, you've got a gift in your hand. What are you going to do with it? And then verse 14, there is obedience that matters. It said there. Go down to verse 14 in this. As obedient children, not conforming yourself to the former lusts and so forth as in ignorance. When he says obedience matters. I don't know how it was wherever you grew up or how you raised or rearing your children, but obedience was absolute. I think as parents, we always expect obedience, don't we? We do. I mean, yeah, we recognize not always going to do what you're supposed to, and I can look at some of you and I know you didn't do what you were supposed to do all the time. I wasn't picking on you, Jordan, but seriously, I think we all recognize that. But there is still a call or a challenge or a demand to be obedient. We understand the parental child roles, and that's what he's using here. He says, we're to look at God as our Father and act as obedient children. We are those who do what we are instructed to do. That's not harsh. That's not what he's trying to get at. That sometimes may sound harsh, but there is obedience that matters. It determines who your loyalty belongs to. Then he challenges us to follow. And you were talking about examples there, Brian. He challenges us to follow a clear example. Look down at verse 15 and 16, where he says, but he who called you is whole, as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. There is that clear example of what we are supposed to be in this, and it says, here's the way he is in this regard. Now then, we're going to come back to the idea of holy if we've got enough time here in just a few minutes and what that means. So we'll leave the meaning of that for a moment, but the idea is you to be like me. Follow me. Do what I do. You go a little bit further and it recognizes God's with us and he's aware of us. He's with us and he's aware of us. He knows where we are. He knows what we're doing. Why? Because he is with us in what we're doing. He's not an absentee father. He's not gone from us. He's with us in the journey we are undertaking. I think sometimes when we make our mistakes or when we fail or when we slide, when we let ourselves slack, it's because we don't recognize the participation of God with us. When things of God become unimportant in our lives, it's because we don't see God with us in it. There's a whole lot we could say about that, but you know how it was when you were a student in school? Some of you go to school. When you were a student in school, yeah, I know you didn't, but when you were a student in school, if the teacher was out of the room, yeah, you smiled. Larry, there was something stirring back there, and I'm not sure what was going on with that. But anyway, yeah, we understand that when we feel like someone is observing us, we behave in a certain manner. But if we're not, we don't feel like that observation is taking place, how do we behave? He says, we need to see that God is not only with us, but he is aware of us. And if you call on the Father who is without partiality, who without partiality judges according to each one's work. In other words, he is observant of all these works. And so you conduct yourself in a certain way. And then a couple more. One, we have to recognize we are valued by him. That's a motivation. You're valued. I think I was reading a list of one of the reasons why people leave the jobs they leave. They didn't feel valued. They didn't feel valued where they were. And so if you didn't feel valued, why would you want to do it? But when an employee feels valued, that employee is much more inclined to remain with the job and everything. I don't know why I was reading that, because I don't have any employees or anything, and I don't like my job anyway. But in all seriousness, if you don't feel valued, you don't want to be there. That's true in most relationships as well. Married people, if they don't feel valued by one another, they don't have as much inclination to remain within the commitments they've made in marriage and so forth. Anyway, but we can get far afield in that regard, but I think we see that, and that's what he's saying. You are valued in this regard. You can go down to verse 18 and 19, knowing that you were redeemed, not with corruptible things like silver and gold. We'd say that's kind of precious. But what were we redeemed with? The precious blood, verse 19, the precious blood of Christ Jesus, a lamb without spot or blemish. In other words, God put his best into this. And so you have value to God. I think it's easy for us if we put God at a distance to not feel like we're valued by God. But if we draw closer to God, we recognize the value that is there in it. And then one more. Because we have a pattern we're following it has been and is an obvious, proven, and provable plan. God laid out a long-term plan, and we become a part of that long-term plan in our practice within it. So that's what Peter gets to in this regard, that it's been an obvious and a proven plan. That's the motivations he throws into here. Here's why you need to live the Christian life. Right here, in these few verses in a succinct way, Peter's a pretty succinct writer. I mean, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time with a whole lot of words when he can get down to the point. This is probably some of the wordiest stuff he shares, but at the same time, he hits all these points, and he hits them rather quickly, and he says, here's how you consider your life. Gird yourself up, get yourself together, recognize what God is doing, get after it, recognize he values you every step of the way, and hold on to those things. I think if we pick up and hold on to these things that he's got, it makes us much more inclined to be what we need to be. Now then, as I get to the discussion questions, and I took a little longer with that than I intended, but as I mentioned, the previous section and the next study points to what we receive. What we're going to study next points to what we receive. And we're going to talk about that at some length next week in what we receive. But looking at this today, let's go to these discussion questions, see if we can get something out of this. The question before us is, if our hope rests fully on grace, an unearned gift or unmerited favor, however you want to describe that, why is there so much consideration of how we conduct our lives? As I said, the New Testament is filled with how we conduct our lives. If our hope rests fully on God's gift, why so much consideration on the conduct of our lives? Okay, without our participation, we intend to push further away, to fall away from him and to fall from grace. And I know there are certain churches have doctrines that you can't fall away, but that is an inaccurate use of Scripture, I believe, and everything, and definitely can. What else? Any other thoughts? Okay. It's kind of like why my mother made me make my bed every morning.
I don't know if she wrote it down.
Well, she didn't write it down, but it was expected.
Paul addressed this in
Yes,
Romans.
I think he does address this in Romans. Why is it like it is? There is a learning in this about who and whose we are as well, and where you belong. From a human standpoint, if we look at it from a very human standpoint, we recognize it only makes sense. If we look at it from a godly standpoint, where did we get the standard? The Old Testament was given to us to teach us what God's will really is, or the difference between sin and righteousness. And then we come to the New Testament, he says, and yet I work with you and I give you the opportunity and grace. Go ahead.
Well, to not do that would bring reproach on the body,
Okay.
as your actions are observed by others.
Okay. It would be in direct contrast. It would bring reproach, as you said, direct contrast to what God's character that we are to absorb really is. I think you're exactly right in that. Okay? Any other thoughts in that regard? Yeah, Keith?
We're still given direction in the scriptures about this idea of conducting
Okay.
So we know that there's things that expectations that God has of us so that we continue to grow,
Okay.
not be, I guess, like you said, fall out of that grace that
Okay. Goes back to what we said a little while ago, and we don't do it, we tend to drift further away from him. And in fact, Peter talks to some degree about that. The writer of the Hebrews talks about that we could tend to drift if we don't give heed to it. And that's the human nature and the creation as we were made. And this ties into the very nature of who we are in that regard. And that's why I think when some want to really emphasize Ephesians 2:8, by grace are you saved through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. But notice what he said, through faith, by grace, through faith. Define what that faith is, and then you get the understanding of what we're talking about here, how we conduct our lives. Faith that is not corroborated in action is not faith. Does that make sense? Okay. Question number two. Oh, I'm sorry, Brian. Go ahead.
kind of the flip side of what I said before, is motivate others, either the outside world to see,
Okay.
propagate faith that way, or edify others.
Okay. It becomes an example for others to see and motivates them as well outside in that regard. Very good. Yeah. Anything else? I don't want to skip something. You got a good thought. There's the first bell. Man, these people that just get carried away with ringing those bells. Okay, number two then. He states, Peter that is, states that we are to be as obedient children. How does that affect our personal will? You think about small children at home and their personal will. Whose will resides in the home? Moms. Oh, yeah, parents. I'm sorry. Yeah, parents. Okay. Do the children have freedom of will? It's pretty limited, isn't it? Yeah, generally speaking, in a proper setup. But he says we act as obedient children. It does not take away our personal will. You know, it's something that we've shared, and I think we all know. You can do about anything you want. You don't have to obey God. You can disobey the laws of the country. You can speed down any street you want to speed down. You can not pay income taxes, whatever. You can go through it all. You can murder people if you want to. You can do all the things that break the laws if you want to. But you have to live with the consequences of it. And that's what it comes down to. You have your personal will. You can still do it. A child at home can still rebel against the parents. They can cry and they can scream. They can kick. They can disobey, especially as they get a little bit older. They can do and not do as they're told to do. But they got to live with the consequences of that. Okay, question number 3. What does it mean to be holy as God is holy? And how is that? Is that really possible? What does it mean to be holy as God is holy? Go ahead.
God has given you a command of morality.
Okay.
And he's given you the greatest of all, love. And of course, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So these are prerequisites of God for you to
Okay.
to be holy in that sense.
Okay. Yeah, you're exactly right. We're looking at the character of God and what he is, the morality, the purity, all of the things that are God. And as we understand him, this is what is the definition of holy, the very character that is God. That's what's holy. It is unique, it is special. And the challenge for us is to absorb and put into practice the character that we see of God. It is not something that is supernatural. It is the very nature of God that we can apply to our lives. Does that make sense? When he says, be holy as I am holy, he's not talking about that you have to be something that you cannot be, but it is to ascribe to your life character that we see and we recognize is of God. Love, morality, and so forth in that regard. Make sense? Okay. Number 4. How does, and he talks about what was paid for us and gives us value, how does the value of what is paid for us affect our responses in life? Think about that generally. Does the value of what is paid for something affect our feelings about it and the way we act toward it?
Takes off that pressure, depending on what it is.
Okay, depending on what it is, it takes off that pressure and everything. Yeah, okay. Let's see, let's suppose you're given 2 gifts. One is bought at the Dollar Tree store for $1, and the other is bought at an expensive jewelry store and thousands of dollars are paid for it. Which one is going to receive the greater care? The one of greater value. That's exactly right. That's the way we connect. When we recognize something has great value that's been given to us, we treat it with a little more specialized care. And a part of what we're being told here is there's been a great price paid for us, and that does take the burden off of us because he paid the price. But at the same time, it makes us recognize how precious the gift really is when we see the value of what it is and given to us. That is a motivator for us as well, and that should affect our responses in life. I think that's why parents sometimes tell their children, after all I've done for you, oh no, they would never say it. I'd never say that to my kids unless I thought I could get away with it. But in all seriousness, very quickly, the second bell's rung, but let's look at that last question. God's plan unfolded over thousands of years to Christ, what I'm talking about. It unfolded over thousands of years. Why did God take so long to do this? I kind of laugh, but there's a certain amount of truth to that, isn't there? It takes mankind a long time to recognize and adjust. And we still don't very well. Any other thoughts? Why did he take so long?
I think it's to show us that there was no other way.
Okay.
Plenty of time, it could have been done without Jesus to prove it.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's the
Yes. What if he had sent Christ shortly after Adam and Eve in the garden? How would we respond today to that and so forth? Yeah. How would mankind have responded then, even if in that limited basis? Yeah. I think very good point in that. I think. Okay. Very good. Again. There's a lot of learning, a lot of visual. We can recognize God in a bigger way. I've often thought, and people often say, I enjoy reading the New Testament, but I don't as much enjoy reading the Old Testament. I think you're never going to fully understand God until you can read the Old Testament. Then you understand God.
Credence to John's chapter 1.
I think you're exactly right. Yes, it sure does when you read John 1 in that regard. Okay, very good, guys. I appreciate you being with me this evening. Next week we'll talk about our heavenly home. How about that? Very good.